Hello! We're live. I don't know if anyone's on yet, but I'm Chloe and I am here to interview and talk to the wonderful and brilliant Rebecca Kuang, the author of The Poppy War. I'm so excited to be doing this. I devoured your book. I actually just finished it today, but I just have to say it is so beautifully written and I absolutely loved every part of it. I already went and bought the second and third book, so I know I'm going to kick myself as soon as I read the second and third book that I wasn't able to talk to you after the whole series, but I am really excited to be talking to you today, so thank you.
Well, thanks so much for having me. This is very cool as somebody who grew up watching Dance Moms, and I can't believe this is happening right now.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And now we're here talking about our love of books together.
Yeah, wild world.
It is. So, I guess not. Is there a way to? Okay. So, well, first, do you mind introducing yourself to the audience and everyone watching, and just sort of give a background on yourself?
I should do that, huh? Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca Kuang. I wrote the Poppy War trilogy. I also have a new book coming out. My publicist will kill me if I don't plug it. In August, called Babel. It's the U.S. cover, the U.K. cover. There's a whole fight over which one's better. I don't have an opinion. I am in the first year of my PhD studying Chinese literature and Asian American literature, and I just write fantasy novels and think a lot about history and culture and all sorts of weird stuff that I turn into stories.
I love how you said, I just write some novels, as if it's so casual that you created this whole series and this whole world. So,
so I feel like in academia, people don't take you very seriously if you also write fiction. So I've gotten used to in classes being like, oh, I write on the side. It's a hobby,
Right.
It's just like a thing that I do. But I feel like it's embarrassing if my advisors know I have this like whole other career. So I try to tone it down as much as I can.
I completely understand and relate to that. I feel like I've always had made my love of fantasy and books and wanting to write a secret, because it always felt like people looked down upon that. Like, I was just talking to some people and they were talking about these nonfiction stories and these memoirs and all of these true academia things, and I feel like I'm always like, oh, I really like fantasy.
Yeah, I feel like fantasy still has this weird stigma of being less serious and more frivolous than proper true literature. Even though there's so much scholarship on how fantasy can offer us lens into all sorts of issues and worlds that other genres aren't uniquely equipped for. So I feel like the tide is starting to turn there a little bit. I feel like people are starting to take fantasy a little more seriously, but it still feels like a bit odd to be in the classroom and be like, oh, and I also write these little fantasy novels. It's no big deal. Don't pay attention to that.
No big deal. No, I completely agree with that. I'd say I agree that the tide is turning a little bit, and there is so much we can learn from it. It's a really great way to better understand our world through almost like a fake world, because by understanding that, we understand how our world relates to it and how we can, the issues we need to fix in our world, because we're more separated from it, in my opinion. I don't even know where to start with my questions about the Poppy War. I guess I'll start with the most basic question. Where did you get the inspiration from? Did the characters come to you first? Did the world come to you first? Was it Rin who popped in your head first, or just the sort of overall idea of it?
Yeah, I think so they say that your first novel takes you 10 years to write and your second novel takes you 1 year to write. And I think it's true in the sense that your first novel is usually just an accumulation of all the influences that you've received, in the process of becoming a human. So similarly, the Poppy War is so it was directly inspired by the fact that in between my sophomore and junior years of college, I took a gap year off to live in Beijing for a while. And it was the first time that I was getting really good at speaking in Chinese, the first time that I'd spoken to my grandparents, directly instead of mediated through this awkward English translation, which I'd done when I was a child, which meant that I was learning all this family history for the first time. And I really wanted to do something with it. And at first I thought maybe I'll do like a family autobiography, maybe write something nonfiction. But as somebody who hadn't even switched her major over to history yet, this felt like a very difficult project to do. Like, you have to like track down all these sources, you have to fact check everything, and I thought it was just much easier to refract it through the lens of fantasy, so that I can fill in the gaps myself where the gaps exist. So I decided to try out this experiment of, instead of reflecting their experiences directly, using those tonal elements and emotional beats to construct a new story. But the setting of the Poppy War and the kind of magical elements that go into it, like the wuxia, kung fu stuff, the student teacher dynamics, and the kind of Chinese myths that go into the world building, all of those are an accumulation of stories that I've grown up hearing, and things that my parents told me, and foods that I've grown up eating. So it really is just this distillation of all the things that had made me who I was when I was 19, which is when I started writing the Poppy War. So it's that sort of like alchemy that really can't be reconstructed. And I think that sort of just like pulling from every single area of your life and creating like a Frankenstein creature with it, with your debut novel, is something that really only happens for the first novel, because you're drawing on all of this for the first time ever. And for every subsequent novel, I've had to be a lot more deliberate about what are the inspirations, what am I researching for this, like which parts exactly of my life am I drawing on from this. But for the Poppy War, it's just like everything comes into this representation of who I am in this moment.
I think that's wonderful. Did you enjoy fantasy growing up? Did
Oh,
you Were you like a big fan of all of the classic fantasy novels and movies?
read Harry Potter, read Lord of the Rings. I'm actually rereading the Lord of the Rings right now because
For
I'm
the
giving the Tolkien
series?
lecture. Yeah, well, so partly for the series, but I'm giving the Tolkien lecture on fantasy literature at Oxford this summer. So I thought, if I'm giving a lecture named after Tolkien, I should probably go back and refamiliarize myself with
Wow.
Tolkien. And I'd read that book, or books, depending on how you define the trilogy, when I was a child, and I loved it. But as an adult, coming back to it, I'm just like, wow, J.R. Tolkien really was the master of fantasy literature. Like, nothing is ever going to beat this. It's just incredible. The made up languages, the descriptions of food and places, all the different kinds of trees he's talking about, the names. It's just the perfect, like, yeah, it is, I think, the best fantasy novel ever written. Nothing will ever beat it. So I was obsessed with that growing up. And I had started reading a bunch of the more modern fantasy writers when I was in college, like China Miéville, N.K. Jemisin, Rebecca Roanhorse, etc. I think we're in a really exciting new golden age of fantasy that's a lot more diverse and subversive and interesting. But I grew up on the classics, and
Right.
they're part of my foundations.
That's amazing. There is this nice transition where it's becoming a whole big world instead of just a few staple pieces, and I think that I'm just transitioning now from just reading mainly YA, which I very much enjoy, but more into the adult world, the new adult, however you want to categorize it. And it's it's really interesting to see the shift, and that's something I really, really deeply admired about your book, about your the way it was. I hope I say this in the way I mean it, but the way it was so straightforward, and it's like it wasn't sugar coated. It, like, I feel like sometimes in YA it's sort of put out as like everything's great, we're gonna figure this out, and I love the struggles that the characters went through, and not that I loved it, but I loved seeing the brutal honesty of it, of their journey, and watching them grow. And I thought it was so interesting watching. I loved the time jumping from Rin being new to the academy and joining the academy, and then skipping forward to the war. And how how did you decide to do that from the beginning? That you knew you wanted to start her out at the academy and then end with the war? Or did it sort of just like write itself as you were going that you wanted to end up at the war?
Yeah, actually, so when I came up with the Poppy War trilogy, I came up with the last book first, and all
Really?
the battle scenes and political factions and sides. So I won't spoil the Burning God for anyone who hasn't gotten there yet. But I had these, so very vaguely, I had these visions of these two opposing generals who had all this history in between them, but you can't get to that fever pitch of those big epic battles without first setting up who are these people, why are they on these sides, and how did this all happen? Because without that history and that drama and that tension, it doesn't really feel significant when they finally
Right.
meet for their final confrontation. So I
Wait, who
thought,
are the
oh
two
man, I have
battles?
to. Oh, I'm not going to tell you. I really don't want to spoil it. It's especially a spoiler for the events of the Dragon Republic. I feel like it's pretty
Okay.
easy to guess, but I'll be
I
quiet
think
about
so.
it.
I think I know, but I didn't mean to interrupt you though. I'm sorry. Keep going.
But yeah, so I thought, oh man, I have to write this like boring like prequel story for them so that the reader knows who they are. And then I thought, well, it should really begin with their school days.
Mhm.
So when I was coming up with the plot events of the Poppy War, I was like, I don't want to be working on this. I want to be working on the last book. But I knew I wanted to cover a lot of ground. I wanted to start from Britain as a child to her growing up, taking the exam,
Mhm.
going to the academy, becoming a soldier, fighting / ending a war. But I think the Poppy War is unique in that it does cover so much territory in a single book. Whereas I think in YA it might be more common to split that up into multiple books. I actually had those conversations when we were first submitting the Poppy War, and we were talking about it to different publishing houses and editors, and a couple of them asked, "Oh, how do you feel about splitting it up into like one volume, which is like Rin goes to Sinigard, is a student, and then it ends at the Battle of Sinigard, and then a second volume that's the war." But ultimately, what I really wanted a tonal shift in the middle of the book, which is the innocence of the student and all of this idealism that they're taught, all these abstract strategies that they study for what they think war will be like, and then just the
Mhm.
devastating reality of what battles are actually like, which don't track at all with the romanticized student life that they've been experiencing up until that point. Like, it's really a novel about the loss of innocence and war trauma and what just like total war does to a person. It changes the world, completely. So
Mhm.
it was important that we started from the very innocent, naive perspective of the
Mhm.
excited new student to the very jaded person she is at the end.
Right. When you were writing, did anything you write or like came up with, did it surprise you, or was it all tracked out, like very tracked out before you began writing? I mean, especially if you knew what the last novel was going to be like, was there anything that happened that you were like, oh, it sort of wrote itself and you weren't expecting, and you're like, I can't believe this is happening, or was it all mapped out?
So I know you're studying creative writing, so I'm curious to hear
Yeah.
about your process, but I
That's sort of why
can't
I'm
plan
fascinated with yours.
I can't plan anything in advance. So everything is
Wow.
vibes only. So I had like the general like sense of like these are the emotions I want involved in the last book, and so here are some of the beats I have to hit in the first book. But aside from that, I really can't sit down and write an outline for an entire novel and then write like
Right.
scenes according to that outline, because I feel like that kind of bird's eye perspective is too divorced from everything interesting that's going on at a scene level. And I have this rule where I won't let myself write a scene unless I'm really feeling that scene. Like, I think
Wow.
like I've never acted, so I don't know what it's like for actors, but like I was watching some Lord of the Rings bloopers the other day, and they were talking about how you really have to like put yourself in this emotional pitch to like be there and present to make a scene work. And I
Mhm.
feel that same way about writing, but since I don't have a director yelling at me all day. I can like choose which scene I want to work on at whatever time. So it's a little easier. But that means the drafting process is very chaotic and complicated. Basically, what I do is for the first like 50,000 words or so of the novel, I just write whatever scenes come to mind that seem like cool and exciting to work on. And it doesn't even matter if it makes absolutely no sense in the context of the plot. Like, if there's an interaction I think might be cool, or even just like a line of dialogue or like a
Mhm.
thing to do. Like, if I went
Mhm.
rock climbing that weekend and I thought I really want to see where my characters are rock climbing because I think climbing is cool,
Oh.
I'll just write it in. And then at the end of this process usually takes like 4 to 5 months. I'll look back and reread this like jumbled mess of word vomit and ask myself like, okay, what's the story here? Like,
Mhm.
what plot can we superimpose on this? And that's when I'll go to the outline stage.
Mhm.
And because I really like structure also. For someone who hates planning so much, I do really like conceiving of stories in terms of a 3-act structure, a 5-act structure. I think like those heuristics help give the plot integrity and make sure it's correctly paced and that like all the acts hold up on their own. So I like having that, but I can't get to that stage unless I've discovered like what's cool about the story already. Then once I have that structure, I go back and start like deleting scenes that they really don't make any sense and reordering scenes and then writing like linking material to get from point A to point B to point C. But this means I delete so much and I change so much, and what the book looks like in its initial stages of drafting is nowhere near the book at the end. But I just have to keep that sense of discovery and excitement about the book through every stage of the process, because I feel like you can always tell in a novel when an author's heart is really not in a scene and they've just included it because like the scene really needs to be there to move the plot along. But I want my readers to feel like I'm very excited and passionate about every single sentence. So this is the only process that works for me.
I think that's so fascinating. I never thought about it that way before, but I can totally understand where you mean about the author not being passionate about it. That's when the scenes sort of fall flat and you're like, oh, waiting to get to the next scene. I'll be looking for that now. But I think I'm so interested in your outline and your writing process because I did just take my first writing class at school. I've been taking a lot of my GEs and all of that, and so I just finished my first screenwriting class, and I was so intimidated by the prospect of writing a full piece because I've started so many things but not finished it, and so writing a full 60-page TV script was daunting. And I very much like to control things, and when I started out not knowing exactly how it was going to go really scared me. And then as I was writing, I was learning that not knowing your plot is actually really helpful because so much comes up that helps further the story in a way that it wouldn't if you'd mapped everything out and had to stick by that. So I found myself going back and like changing so much, but I was okay with it because it made sense to the story and helped further the story along. But I think it was fun when things would surprise me. I'd just be writing and I'd be like, oh, okay, I guess we're going there now. I guess we're doing this.
Yeah. No, that's the advantage of not coming up with a structure that you have to adhere to from the beginning, because when like something really interesting presents itself, you just like you chase it to wherever it leads. And your subconscious creative mind always surprises you with things you didn't know could be in the story from the get-go.
Exactly. Well, speaking of what surprised me, Rin and is it Neza?
Naja. Yeah, it's a bit tough if you don't
apologize.
speak Chinese.
Naja. I looked it up and it said Neza, so I'm sorry about that. Naja.
No, that name is very hard, but you should just treat the ZH like a J.
Okay, perfect. Naja. I was surprised about that. That's not something I was expecting. And like I said, I'm only in the first book, but I guess I have to read the second and third book. I know you're not going to spoil it. But that was really unexpected for me. And well, what was your favorite relationship to write? Whether it was mentor or students or anyone?
Oh, I really love all of the relationship dynamics in the Poppy War. There's so much about Rin and Naja, but that really is a big spoiler to talk about. So I'll leave everyone to just read The Dragon Republic and The Burning God. But two relationships that I really loved working on are first Rin and Jiang, the crazy lore master, in part because student-teacher dynamics, or the master and the student dynamic is really big in Chinese mythology and a lot of Chinese pop culture, like kung fu films, especially the kung fu master and the disciple. And I've joked about taking my favorite dynamic from Kung Fu Panda, because Kung Fu Panda did not like originate this. It's a very classic storyline, but I really love the way they did it, which is the trope of the master and the student. Like the antagonist is the former student who the master failed in some way.
Right.
So with Rin and Jiang and Alton, Jiang was not a good teacher to Alton. He didn't give him all the mentorship that he needed. So with Rin, so much of their relationship is about not making those same mistakes and ruminating on what are the ways in which a teacher can fail their student. I think that's a really precious and fascinating relationship because there's so much potential for hurt on both sides, but also so much potential for love and support. And there's just a lot of stuff you can do with it to make scenes very dramatic and explosive. So that was fun to write. Another relationship was between Rin and Kitai, who is just a precious cinnamon roll and who is my favorite character to write always. I think that in YA novels in particular, but also in a lot of adult fantasy, it's really rare to just see healthy platonic relationships between men and women. Like I think part of it is also pressure in the publishing industry. I mean, I love my editor. He's great. He's really made my books better in so many ways. But every time I got edits back, he'd be like, what about having a love triangle? Like, what if there was some like romantic tension between these characters? And I'm like, I just don't want to get into that. Like, what if we didn't? What if we just let them be friends? And I think that kind of platonic representation is so important. And I love that Rin and Katai's friendship is just completely uncomplicated by any suggestions that one of them might be attracted to the other. They're just ride or die besties, and they're with each other until the end. And it never turns into a love triangle or anything trite and silly. It's just, they're just there for each other. And I think that's really beautiful.
I did love their relationship so much, and I never got the sense that it was hinting at more than that. I loved how deeply rooted it was in just support and friendship and encouragement. It was that the highlight of the book throughout all of the brutality and savagery, and of course at the end with everything that happened, their friendship, being there for each other, just always was like a spot of goodness, regardless of what they had been through, just knowing that they were coming back for each other. And when Rin found him, I was so happy. I was like, oh.
Yeah. I loved writing that scene. He's too good for this world.
He really is. He is such a cinnamon roll. I didn't even think of that, but he is the cinnamon roll of the book.
People are always tagging me in fan art of Rin and Noja because they're like the cool ones, and I'm like, this is great, this is wonderful, this is beautiful. But when I get tagged in fan art of Kitai, I get so happy because he's my favorite.
I love that. Well, if I could draw, I would draw some Kitai, but I can't draw that. I'll just be looking it up. Well, if you were at, it's Seingard, right? Seingard?
So this is an interesting question because people are always asking me how to pronounce things, and honestly, I don't hear the pronunciations of any of the names when I write them. So I feel like I've given very contradictory answers to things over the years. I think like Sinegard works, Seingard also works. I don't know.
Okay, I think everyone.
But it's one of those things where I feel like, oh, the author should have an answer, but I really do not have an answer. You can pronounce it however you like.
Okay, I'm just always worried about pronouncing things because I always pronounce them wrong, and I'm always like looking them up to say it, how to say it before I say it, and then I always forget because I'm like, don't say it wrong, and I forget. But Sinegard, if you were there, what path would you have taken? What subject would you have chosen?
Well, I'm not a very violent person, and I don't want to study warfare or combat. So honestly, I would have liked to study lore. That's kind of what I do now. I study literature, and I'm literally paid to just sit on my butt and read novels and think about fiction and talk about the writing of fiction and the evolution of myths and how stories evolve and respond to each other and morph and shift according to whatever climate they're created in. So I think I'm like Jiang in that way, although, I actually have to lead my TF discussions instead of just like fucking off and being like, everyone just hang out in this garden. I will be away smoking weed.
But I did love him so much. He was one of my favorites. And he's the gatekeeper, now we know. I was like, that was my theory the whole time, especially when he said, someone mentioned something to him and he was like, I don't remember you at all. And I remember someone saying like the gatekeeper he's stuck in a mortal body, doesn't have like the full scope of his memories, I believe, unless I got that wrong.
But yeah, So one of my favorite tropes in mangas and like kung fu dramas is when like the old fool character, like the kind of the comic relief character, suddenly has their like badass moment, and it's like whoa, like they're secretly more powerful than any of the other characters. So writing Jiang's moment during the battle for Sinigard, I was like, this is it. This is the most epic moment in the entire book.
I love that one moment and all of the other fighting going on. It was really, really sick. I loved that and felt so satisfied when I got that theory right. What was your favorite part of the whole book, of the first book? I just want to ask so many more questions, but I'm trying not to spoil it for other people, and I'm trying not to spoil it for myself for the last two, so I'm working in a limited window.
So for the first book, I mean, there are obviously like so many epic battle scenes and like war strategy scenes and whatever, and that's kind of my bread and butter. That's what I enjoy writing the most. And I don't think this is much of a spoiler, but there's this one scene in the middle where Rin is visiting Katai at his house for the summer vacation. And with that, I got to take a break from all the violence and brutality and strategy and like very dry discussions of politics, and just work in a lot of details from my favorite memories of foods I'd eaten in China with my grandparents or things I'd seen across my travels, and just in like wandering around Beijing. So everything that they're eating, everything, all the festivities that they're witnessing are things that I had experienced during that year. For example, the little statues, the statues of the little boys who like pee when you pour water on them. I remember those so vividly from my childhood. We'd see like street hawkers all the time, like with these little statues, and I'd be like, oh, they're so gross. I really want one. And my mom never got me one. And the experience of eating hot pot so spicy that you feel it the next day out the other end. Also something that I had very recently experienced on a trip to Chongqing, right before I wrote that scene. So I think I always enjoy when fantasy novels take a break from all the plot heavy stuff and just let us explore and delight in the world a little bit. I think in Harry Potter, all the feast scenes and the Christmases at the Weasley scenes were some of my favorites, because like it's just nice to explore the small delights of the world through food and entertainment, and all those like little details that fill in the crevices of the world that help the reader remember that, oh, this story is not just like one big epic conflict. Like these are the little things at stake when lives are upended, these small pleasures.
Exactly. It's what makes us fall in love with the characters so much, because we see them at their most human moments. And so that's what allows us to follow their journey into the really rough moments when they make decisions we might question. We go back to them before all of this conflict and when they were just human and they weren't given these decisions and hard choices. So I think that's really beautiful about the small moments that form a character. It makes sense that it would be so impactful.
Yeah, and it just gives shape to the worlds. Like, I'm reading
Exactly.
Lord of the Rings right now, and all the scenes where they just stop for a moment in Rivendell and come up with some poems to recite to each other and eat all the good food. Oh, I always love descriptions of food in fantasy novels. I linger over them because I'm like, wow, that sounds really good. That sounds really good.
Have you ever made a recipe like you like when
Yeah,
anything you read
so
in?
while I was at Oxford, my friends and I did this fantasy-themed dinner where all of the dishes are something that might be served at Elrond's table. So in Lord of the Rings, there's this food called lembas bread, and it's, like if you just have like 2 bites of it, it's enough to give you sustenance for your entire journey. So we had this competition where we all had like basic ingredients like milk and sugar and flour, all different kinds of flour, and we're like, okay, everybody like come up with what you think lembas bread is, and then we'll have a blind taste test and see who wins. So I did this like cute like almond shortbread thing with the leaf design on top, and I thought it was great. But my friend Julius cheated and just used a lot of sugar and a lot of milk, and everybody liked his lembas bread. And I think my lembas bread is more true to what it actually tasted like. And it looked prettier, but whatever. People are just suckers for what tastes good.
I see the competitiveness coming out.
No, I
I
think
love that.
fantasy-themed dinners are so fun to do. I'm watching Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King with my
Mhm.
friends tomorrow. Clearly, I'm in like a Tolkien moment, and we're trying to decide what to do for dinner. And they're like, let's just order Cheesecake Factory. And I'm like, no,
We gotta do the whole thing.
I'm going to make my famous lotus bread.
I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna win the competition. Well, I will be having a dinner and making all the food I see here. I will challenge myself because I am not a chef at all. I'm the baker, so I will I will try to do that. That sounds really fun. That's such a good idea. Uh, let's see. I'm like, I just want to know everything about the second and third book. I'm just reeling. Like I said, I finished this morning and I'm like, okay, I'm going on vacation tomorrow in between my semester and my summer class. And I just plan to devour the other two the whole time. So I will probably be like messaging you on Instagram, like, oh my God, now I know who the two generals are.
Well, I
I'm
hope you
so
have fun
excited.
with them.
I'm so excited. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and talk about your beautiful, wonderful, brilliant book. And I'm really excited to read the other two and to read Babel.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I really had fun.
I had so much fun. Thank